recent Facebook post said something like this: imagine a world in which people lined up to help others in the same numbers that they lined up for the newest iPhone. We humans are quite inventive and pretty successful at turning priorities inside out. We get what matters confused with things that we might well have forgotten about a week from now. Our values get skewed as we turn away from those things that trouble us most deeply. The story from Mark's Gospel tells of Jesus making an intentional effort to pull his friends aside to have a serious conversation. He said he took a different way so that he could have this private meeting with them. He's telling them his worst fears, and he's entrusting them with profound truth. From a deep and vulnerable place, Jesus tells them that he will be rejected, betrayed, and killed. Then he continues, knowing just how unbelievable he sounds to them. He confides in them that 3 days after all these things happen, he'll be raised from the dead. Okay, hold that scene in your mind for a moment. Jesus pulling them away, entrusting them with his intimate thoughts. Hold that as we look at the events that just preceded this meeting. Jesus and his disciples had been on the mountaintop where Jesus was transfigured. Do you remember that story? It's kind of surreal events. They watched as Jesus was changed from his normal appearance. He glowed. And then out of nowhere, Moses and Elijah, who had been dead for who knows how many years, appeared with them. And then, if that weren't enough, the voice of God spoke, identifying Jesus as God's beloved. Pretty funky stuff, really. And so the disciples just freaked. They started saying things like, okay, well, wow, let's just stay here then. We'll build houses for everybody. We'll build a house for Elijah and a house for Moses and a house for you, Jesus. Stop the world right now. No more weird changes, please. We're rocking along with Jesus teaching and healing. Our lives are good. We learn about God's love and feel like our lives mean something for the first time, so stop. Enough. Well, after these odd events and the rise in the disciples' anxiety, they went down the mountain. And Jesus found that place and time for this hard conversation about what was in store for him. Jesus was taking a chance on them, showing himself to them honestly and vulnerably. After all, they had just been on the inside of the most intimate moment, where the power of God overcame Jesus and shone through him. They were spiritual insiders now, or so it seemed, as close as human beings can be to the soft vulnerability of the other. And then they heard his secret, God's secret about him. They must have been absolutely terrified. It had implications for them, for their lives, for their peace, and they were confused and upset. We wouldn't have been surprised if they had absolutely panicked, if they had denied what Jesus predicted was true at all. It would have made sense for them to argue with him or to try to strategize a way out of what he was telling them. We wouldn't have even been surprised if they had just turned and said, okay, enough, we're out of here, can't stand it. We wouldn't have been surprised if they had just deserted him then and there. Any of these responses would have been logical. But they do something different. They tune out completely. They change the subject. They pick arguments with each other. You see, they didn't much want to hear what Jesus told him. They didn't need this confusion. They preferred their life with Jesus just as it was. After all, good things were happening. People's lives were being changed. Those who had been treated like nobodies were now somebodies. People who had suffered for years were being healed. Life was full. They may have even said to one another, God is good all the time. What was Jesus talking about then? Being killed, being betrayed, rising from the dead. They had to turn away, not hear him. They had to stay normal and safe and calm. Jesus saying that he would suffer and die. Nope, not having one bit of that. They planned just to continue and follow Jesus, and life would be good and go on. They are so bothered by what they've heard that Mark tells us that they refused. They were afraid to ask him, lest they get answers, I presume. So they change the subject and they argue about petty, self-focused, nonsensical issues that there's no answer for. When they avoid the difficult things, when they refuse to ask the pressing, obvious questions that are the elephant in the room, they not only get sidetracked, but they start to take each other down. Not only do they argue, but they argue about who's the most important in the realm of God. Do you see the irony? Jesus drew them close, and they turned away, and now they were arguing about who was the closest. Jesus told them about giving up his power and receiving the power of God, and they were arguing about who was in the power seat. If they could somehow feel comfortable, feel good about their place in relation to Jesus, maybe this other stuff would just go away. Our passage from James speaks to this way of human behavior, saying that those who imagine that they are above others are actually below them, because the wisdom that they practice does not come from God, but is unspiritual. And so inappropriate actions cannot help but follow. Earlier in his book, James has said that false wisdom talks incessantly, but true wisdom listens. The disciples wouldn't listen to Jesus. But imagine if they had. Imagine for a moment if the disciples had actually been present with that vulnerable Christ. If they had dared to ask, okay, Jesus, what is it you're saying to us? Who would betray you? Is it me? What does it mean anyway to betray you? We don't know what you're talking about. Rising from the dead, that's ridiculous. Besides, God wouldn't let that happen. We have that right about God, don't we? That God wouldn't allow you to suffer. God would never let that happen to you or to us, that we would be left behind. And what are you saying about death? That it doesn't exist, that it doesn't matter? Oh, what a difference that would have made. Jesus could have drawn them in even closer. He could have spoken clearly to them about the power of self-giving love, about the Spirit that would continue to be available to them, about their lives, their fears, and their power. But that's not what happened. They were too afraid or too confused. Many of us are also afraid to ask those hard questions. It may be because we think we're already supposed to understand if we're people of faith, and we don't want to look bad or dumb or spiritually out of tune. Other times we think it's really bad faith to ask questions because we're supposed to know and believe. Most often, though, I think it may be because we don't want to face the potential answers that we fear, answers that change our lives, that challenge us. We don't want this house of cards that we've built to fall, for things we hold on to change, or perhaps not be true, at least in the way we hoped. We think if we never speak the unspeakable, if we refuse to entertain possibilities that could topple our world, that we can continue in blissful oblivion. So we tap into that undeniable human ability to get sidetracked, to tune out, to ignore, to pretend what isn't important is, what seems too hard or too dangerous or too distressing, we keep then underground or at least at arm's length. The irony, of course, is that we miss what can give our lives the most peace and the deepest truth. We miss being in touch with our own not knowing, with our own vulnerability. That is at the very heart of what it means to be human, and therefore keeps us from being in full relationship with God and with one another. What hard truths do we avoid? What significant questions do we let go unanswered or even unasked? What do we attempt to safeguard by ignoring it and getting caught up in things that don't matter? Do we stick our fingers in our ears to shut out what might be too ambiguous or too confounding, only to miss the most important wisdom and truth that we can only find by going to the hard places? Or worse yet, do we intimate by our preoccupation with things and with shallowness that seeking the truth just simply doesn't matter all that much? Just give us a pat answer, enough spirituality, and we'll call it faith, and that's good enough. But I think there's a problem with this. I think, my friends, that deep down, our spirits know better. Deep down, we know that those nagging questions matter, don't we? We are fully aware of the problems of life and God and pain and doubt. Those troubling contradictions or dilemmas that seem to jeopardize everything we hold dear, that cause us to worry about ourselves and those we love, and the whole world maybe. We know that they're important. And so I ask us this morning, what subjects or doubts do you avoid? What have you dared not ask or state? What might even seem heresy to ask in church or perhaps out loud? What questions lurk in your heart with scary potential answers? Answers that just might shake your foundations. And then I ask us, can we consider the possibility of turning from our distractions, even from our formula faith, even from the goodness of work or family, to get to the heart of, to face head on our existential fears and doubts? Oh, life throws us there from time to time, doesn't it? When we're faced with an untimely death of someone in our lives, or when we can't avoid seeing senseless suffering. When these things happen, we're swallowed up by those primal questions about existence, about the elusive meaning of life, about the point or pointlessness of it all. At those times, we wonder what God is up to, or we resent the apparent reality that God must not be paying attention to the horrors of life, or things would not happen like this. But if we moved this honesty, this depth, from a time of crisis to our everyday lives of faith, I believe that our faith would take on new relevance. It would be based in a here and now honesty. And I believe it would make our fears diminish. What if we said, no more taboo doubts, no more taboo questions or objections, no more kowtowing to strange doctrines of God that insist that we be mute and obedient, and no more sidetracking. We'll deal with what's important. we'll put those important things in our days first, knowing then that there will be room to fill it up with all the other things that are important to us. If we can be more human, more honest, more vulnerable and real with the Spirit and one another, our lives, I believe, will be transformed. When I read the Gospel of Mark, I'm convinced that these honest, emotional, and intellectual responses are just exactly what Jesus wanted from his friends. He didn't want them to go away. He didn't want them to start stupid arguments about who was the greatest. He wanted to know that he mattered to them, that they heard what he said, and that they were willing to delve into it with him. This, I believe, is still God's desire for us to engage life, for us to engage the really tough stuff without getting sidetracked by things that don't really matter, even when we're afraid of what we'll find or what we won't find. If you could speak what's on your mind, if you could ask honest questions about God or life or goodness or morality, about the Bible or death or suffering, what would you ask? Really, what would you ask? Now's your time. We've all asked it, haven't we? Why do bad things happen to good people? I also want to know why good things happen to bad people, but that's another thing. Yeah. What else? How can God permit things that we think ought not to be so and obviously cause suffering? What's the point? How can we really forgive? Why can't we stand up to oppression? Does God really know each one of us individually? These are important questions. They're ones we all think about, and I believe they're ones we all avoid as well. But if we push them aside, my friends, they take on a life bigger than they are, and they cause us to miss the one who begs us to ask these questions. We'll miss the depth and the fullness and the meaning of the journey. And I believe we'll also, sooner or later, get disillusioned with all the stuff that we fill our lives with while we're avoiding the things that matter. Can we be brave enough to recognize when what we're doing is sidetracking ourselves? And then, can we be honest enough to face what might indeed shake us up? Spirituality that goes through the motions and only shows up on good days is basically worthless. But the Christ who values the vulnerable and the honest, like little children, asks us to sit and listen and talk, to bring all that is disconcerting or troubling, all that stirs fear and doubt. And he assures us that God is present all the time, ready, waiting for us to show up. May it be so. Amen. This conversation. He said he took a different way so that he could have this private meeting with them. He's telling them his worst fears, and he's entrusting them with profound truth. From a deep and vulnerable place, Jesus tells them that he will be rejected, betrayed, and killed. Then he continues, knowing just how unbelievable he sounds to them. He confides in them that 3 days after all these things happen, he'll be raised from the dead. Okay, hold that scene in your mind for a moment. Jesus pulling them away, entrusting them with his intimate thoughts. Hold that as we look at the events that just preceded this meeting. Jesus and his disciples had been on the mountaintop where Jesus was transfigured. Do you remember that story? It's kind of surreal events. They watched as Jesus was changed from his normal appearance. He glowed. And then out of nowhere, Moses and Elijah, who had been dead for who knows how many years, appeared with them. And then, if that weren't enough, the voice of God spoke, identifying Jesus as God's beloved. Pretty funky stuff, really. And so the disciples just freaked. They started saying things like, okay, well. A recent Facebook post said something like this: imagine a world in which people lined up to help others in the same numbers that they lined up for the newest iPhone. We humans are quite inventive and pretty successful at turning priorities inside out. We get what matters confused with things that we might well have forgotten about a week from now. Our values get skewed as we turn away from those things that trouble us most deeply. The story from Mark's Gospel tells of Jesus making an intentional effort to pull his friends aside to have a serious